Can Black people be racist? Let's find out. Hello, welcome back to my channel where we talk about faith, race, and how to navigate this thing we call life. As many of you know, I am a racial equity coach, and so many times I have gotten this question: can Black people be racist? In fact, I've even gotten, can people of color in general be racist? And now we are going to find out. So you might remember from a couple of videos ago, we actually talked about what racism is. And I'll go ahead and I'll make sure that I link it. Be sure to look at this video if you haven't already. I actually think it's really helpful. It breaks it down into plain English. And essentially, what it talks about is the fact that racism equals racial prejudice plus systemic power, okay? That is so important, because guess what? Usually people confuse racism with racial prejudice. The two are different, right? There's a common factor, which is the racial prejudice, right? In other words, being like, hey, I don't like you because you are of a particular racial group, okay? That is racial prejudice, okay? But what makes racism is the fact that it's racial prejudice, meaning I don't like you because of the color of your skin, matched with, dun dun dun, power. And when we're talking about power, we're talking about systemic power. Okay, so that means that we're talking about the racial wealth divide, right? That exists between white and Black, between white and non-white Latino, between white and Indigenous, so on and so forth, right? That is a form of power. Another form of power is looking at our political structure. Guess what? It was formed by white men. And guess what? It's still predominantly white men. That is telltale that guess what? The political systems at virtually all levels of government are still dominated by white people. And then within that, predominantly looking at white men. So guess what? That is really important, because when we're thinking about power as it pertains to policies and our legal system, then that means that guess what? The majority of power is still concentrated among white people in a non-representative way of how the US is actually constructed when we're thinking about racial demographics, okay? So that's another form of power. Let's think about another form of power, social power, right? So this is kind of when we get into privilege. So having the benefit of the doubt, right, is something that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color just don't have when it comes to, let's say, the police, when it comes to teachers and maybe telling the truth, whether or not a student is perceived as telling the truth or not, whether or not a student is perceived as having behavioral issues or not, whether a student is perceived as being deserving of another chance or not, all those different things. The perception of deservedness, the perception of kind of having the benefit of the doubt, or deserving the benefit of the doubt. That's all part of social power. Another piece of social power is being respected. So how many of us have actually been in rooms where we've been included, but we have not been respected? Maybe we've raised our hands and we've shared our thoughts, but they were quickly dismissed. Okay, I know as a woman of color, I've experienced that, right? I know a lot of other women of color experience that. This is a real thing, it happens. But oftentimes, what I've noticed is, and there was actually an incident that I know I'm pretty open about in sharing, that at one of the jobs that I had, I pushed a particular effort for a very, very, very long time. And guess what? Kept getting knocked down. There was another Black woman who pushed a similar effort. The same thing. It was knocked down. But guess what? As soon as I told that same effort to a white woman who asked, what can I do? Within a matter of a few weeks, she not only had it approved, but she also had the resources behind it that was organizationally backed by higher ups to essentially institute the idea that I had for many years, and the idea that the other Black woman who was my colleague had for many years too. This is part of social power. Is your voice respected enough to actually be included and to be adhered to, right? This is all part of social power. How are people interacting with you when you do provide an idea, or when you are in the room, or when you do try to assert different recommendations, or whatever the case is? Are people more prone to listen to you because they look at you and they've been socialized to think, oh, you're a more trusted voice, you're a more knowledgeable voice, right? This is all part of social power, okay? So these are just a few forms of power, but you see that it's not only on the individual level, we're talking about systemic power. So even for someone who is, let's say, a white person who is poor, for example, they still benefit from systemic power of being white, right? They still benefit from the racial wealth divide at that lowest income threshold, where the racial wealth divide actually increases among households who are experiencing poverty. They still experience social power in the form of them receiving kind of the benefit of the doubt, being the trusted voice, all of that stuff in the same space that maybe a Black person from the same social caste might be viewed as, and they still experience other forms of privileges that essentially guard their protection. And when you're thinking about politics, again, they're overrepresented in politics as well. That forms our policies and kind of safeguards our legal systems. So with that said, that is what we're talking about when we say power, okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that a particular white person doesn't necessarily experience hardship on an individual basis, but in terms of systemically, they have access to that power, aka that white privilege and all of that other stuff that many of us have talked about over the years, okay? So when we do the flip side of it and we say, hey, like, do Black people experience that power? Do non-white Latino people experience that power? Do indigenous populations experience that power? Do Asian populations experience that power in its fullness, right? Then generally when we do the math, we see, guess what? We don't. We just simply don't experience that systemic power. So the fact that there is a racial wealth divide between white and Black people is a telltale for not experiencing the economic systemic power. But then when you look at the social power, then it's very telling at the fact that the majority of social issues are not only disproportionately, but at just such a high rate, negatively impacting Black communities above all communities of color. When you're thinking about police brutality, suspension rates in schools, all of those different things, again, are targeting Black people, okay? So then you have political power, and yes, while there are Black people in different places of politics, it's not in a representative way, and certainly not across the whole United States. So there's all of those things, okay? The same goes for non-white Latino populations, the same goes for Asian populations when it comes to having systemic power, and the same goes for indigenous populations, okay? And not only experiencing the racial wealth divide, but then all of the different sources of lack of power, systemic power at least, that I was referring to. So because for all of us, all the people of color, we do not experience being able to have access to systemic power in the ways that I just outlined, then that means that it's impossible for us to be racist, okay? It's impossible because racism equals racial prejudice plus systemic power. So when you take out that systemic power, then it is possible for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to have racial prejudice, okay? We can have racial prejudice against white people, right? Maybe as a result of just years of resentment from all the racism and crap that we've had to deal with and that we still have to deal with, and that is largely unresolved. right? Or we could have racial prejudice against each other, right? Whereby maybe Latino populations are like, I don't like Black people, or maybe Black people are like, I don't like Asian people, or vice versa, right? But it lacks the systemic power, so it's not racist, right? So it's just racial prejudice. That gets me to my second point. Even though we as people of color cannot be racist, we can maintain racism. Okay? Let me repeat that. Even though we cannot be racist, meaning that we also have access to systemic power, we can maintain the system that is oppressing us. Okay, so we can maintain racism. Some of you might be like, Marlisa, that doesn't make any sense. I just thought you said that Black people and other people of color cannot be racist, but you can maintain racism. Yes, and yes. Okay, we can maintain racism. Okay, the ways that we can maintain racism might be by different thoughts, behaviors, decisions, or actions that we pursue. An example might be lighter skinned Black people making fun of the darker skinned Black people for being too dark, and maybe being like, hey, like, you're ugly. Or maybe it might be me trying to straighten my hair thinking that I derive beauty from straightened hair only. Or it could be me as a Black woman feeling more comfortable with someone who's white leading over me, and me questioning them less. But then as soon as I have a person of color who's in leadership over me, then starting to kind of question them more and doubt them more, and kind of maintain the status quo of valuing white voices, thoughts, emotions, leadership over Black, Indigenous, and other voices, thoughts, emotions, leadership, all of that stuff. These are just really simple ways that we can actually maintain the racial oppression that we've been taught, okay? But remember, because we've experienced racial oppression on a systemic level, that inherently means that we do not benefit in the same way that white people do systemically from power. Until we do, then that means that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color cannot be racist, but we can maintain racism. And the way that we need to no longer maintain racism is to decolonize our mind, to pray, seek God, make sure that we are renewing our mind daily, that we're asking God to show us where we have blind spots, where we have been reinforcing self-hatred, and so on and so forth, so that we're no longer maintaining racism. And for white people, that means to be very cautious of the fact that not only have we been inherently socialized to have racial prejudice, but guess what? They, by definition of being white within the context of what is now considered the US, have access to systemic power. So because of that, they have to be really intentional about decolonizing their every thought, their every action, their every decision, their every behavior, making sure that they're constantly taking it to the Lord, asking God, hey, can you direct me? Can you lead me in your love? Can you show me the way that I need to love my Black and brown brothers and sisters, because the world has not shown me how to do that. Lord, please allow me to love the way that you love, to see the way that you see, and to act the way that you act. So these are just some of the things to essentially help you all to a very, very common question that I get, which again is, can Black people or even can other people of color be racist? And the answer is no, because we do not have the systemic power tied with racial prejudice to equal racism. Okay, I hope that this was helpful. Definitely be sure to put something in the comments if you have a question, if you want me to do another video that's related. I would love to help and support. Until next time.